March 1946. Somewhere in the American sector of Berlin. A nameless photographer, an army private whose diary was never found, captured this single frame before disappearing into the ruins. But who are the people frozen in this moment? A German mother gripping the hands of an American soldier as if begging for something unspeakable. Two children standing behind her, wide-eyed, half-starved, unsure whether this man is a savior or a threat. And why does the soldier look back at her not with anger, but with something closer to fear? Historians still argue about what happened in the minutes before and after this photograph was taken. Some say it was a plea for mercy. Others whisper it was the beginning of a secret that would bind two families for generations. What is certain is this: nothing in this photograph is what it appears to be, and the truth behind it is far more haunting and far more human than anyone expected. March 1946. American sector, Berlin. The snow looked clean until you saw what it was covering. Beneath the white crust lay a city peeled open like a broken dollhouse, its walls torn away, its rooms exposed to the cold sky. A dresser still stood upright on a third floor with no exterior wall, drawers half open as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. A bed frame hung at an angle over a courtyard full of shattered bricks. Every gust of wind carried the smell of wet ash, coal smoke, sewage, and something older, rot that had seeped into the bones of the city. Children, thin as shadows, picked through heaps of rubble with numb fingers. They dug for potato peels, burned crusts of bread, anything with weight. One boy cracked an icicle off a broken drain pipe and ate it, pressing it against his lips until the cold made them bleed. Berlin had surrendered 11 months ago, but the hunger stalking its streets was only getting stronger. Just beyond the ruins, standing alone beside a bombed-out fountain, was an American soldier. His wool overcoat was thick, his boots were dry, his rifle rested against his shoulder with casual ease. His helmet sat slightly pushed back on his head, revealing a young face still round at the cheeks. When he shifted his weight, something in his pocket rustled, a bar of chocolate wrapped in paper. Behind that paper was American excess, 3,800 calories a day shipped across the ocean by a nation whose factories had just finished flooding the world with tanks, bombers, and Liberty ships. And now one of those soldiers stood in the heart of a city surviving on barely 1,000 calories, when they were lucky. This wasn't propaganda. It was reality. Anna Schaefer watched him from beneath the collapsed frame of what had once been a bakery. She was 28, but hunger had carved 5 extra years into her face. Her shoes had holes punched clean through the soles. Newspapers softened the bite of the icy ground. Her coat was so thin the wind moved through it as though she wore nothing at all. Her stomach had been empty for 3 days. She had given the last potato to her children and pretended she wasn't hungry, but her legs trembled from more than cold now. She held her son on her hip, though he weighed almost nothing, and her daughter's hand in her free one. Both children were small for their ages, shrunk by ration cards that promised food but rarely delivered it. Klaus's stockings sagged around legs as thin as sticks. Liesel stared at the snow the way children stare at candy they cannot have. In another life, they might have been running across a playground. In this one, they were drifting slowly toward starvation, as thousands of German civilians were during that brutal winter. Anna had been raised to believe certain things: that Germany was strong, that its enemies were monsters, that Americans were brutes who would take what they wanted, shame women, steal children. Those messages had never stopped during the war. They poured from the radio like poison, voices that called Americans Feinde, devils, Jew lovers, men who would crush German honor. Even now, months after the surrender. Those words echoed whenever she saw the shape of a foreign helmet. Across the street, the American soldier bent to adjust a strap on his boot. Steam curled from his breath. He smelled of soap, tobacco, and wool warmed by a dry barrack stove. To Anna, who had lived through months of unwashed clothes, coal dust, and the sour odor of crowded cellars, that scent alone was shocking. He seemed untouched by the hunger that wrapped itself around Berlin like a second winter. His country had sent him here from a place overflowing with meat, coffee, sugar, gasoline, and electricity. A land where factories still roared through 3 shifts even after victory, and where the hum of American industry had become the heartbeat of the free world. Detroit had pushed out thousands of engines a month. California shipyards had slid a Liberty ship into the water every few days. Farmers in Iowa and Kansas had produced more wheat than entire nations could consume. And now those soldiers, born from a generation that carried the weight of the world on their backs, were walking the ruins of cities their planes had once targeted. The greatest generation, Americans called them. And in Berlin, a woman who had grown up under the opposite kind of system now stood face to face with what her leaders had called the enemy. But the enemy had food. That was the moral knot tightening in Anna's chest as she watched the soldier kick a loose brick across the pavement. Her husband had died in the last year of the war. Her children were losing weight faster than she could hide. Rations had fallen to famine levels. A doctor in Berlin had written, "We no longer treat illness. We treat starvation." And the only people in Berlin who clearly still had enough to eat were the foreign soldiers she had been told to fear. Behind that fear, something else flickered, an old pride she had been taught since childhood. Pride insisted that a German woman should never beg from a foreigner. Pride insisted she turn away. Pride insisted she tighten her coat, swallow her hunger, and pray for better rations next week. But hunger made its own arguments. Hunger had no ideology. Hunger had no nationality. Hunger had 2 faces, her sons and her daughters. Across the ocean, Americans reading newspapers saw a different picture. A Europe in ruins, a continent divided between democracy and the growing shadow of the Soviet Union. At home, veterans returned to booming cities, to marriages, to factory jobs fueled by economic engines unmatched in history. The United States now produced half of the world's goods. It had the chance to shape not only battlefields, but what came after. For the first time in modern history, a victorious power had to decide: crush a defeated enemy, or help rebuild it. Many empires, a historian would later write, had the opportunity to feed those they conquered. Few chose to do it. America was about to choose. Anna didn't know any of this. She only knew the weight of her children's hands and the sound of their empty breathing. But the American soldier standing alone in the snow was part of a nation wrestling with a question larger than war. What do you do with your abundance? There was a time, not so long ago, when Americans believed the answer mattered. When strength wasn't measured only by bombs, but by what you shared. When victory wasn't defined by humiliation, but by mercy. As Anna watched the soldier shift his rifle and look down the street, she felt the moment sharpening like a blade. She had one choice: obey the fear that had ruled her for years, or step toward the only person in Berlin who looked capable of saving her children's lives. The snow kept falling. The city kept starving. And somewhere in the quiet, a truth older than war pressed forward. Survival sometimes means walking toward the very person you were taught to fear most. This wasn't propaganda. It was reality. The fear did not begin on that snowy street. It had been seeded years earlier, whispered into German kitchens, shouted from radios, and poured like acid into the minds of women who had nowhere else to look for truth. Anna had grown up with a radio in the corner of her family's small apartment, its wooden cabinet polished by her mother's hands. During the war, it became the most powerful object in the home, not because of its shape or sound, but because no one dared question what came out of it. Amerikaner sind Monster, the announcer's voice would thunder. Americans are monsters. Sie werden unsere Frauen entehrt, unsere Kinder stehlen. They will dishonor our women, steal our children. Sie haben keine Ehre, keine Moral. They have no honor, no morality. The voice was always confident, always certain, always outraged, even when the ground trembled from distant bombs, even when the sky turned orange over Berlin, even when the news grew darker each week, the voice never wavered. In the dim space of an air raid cellar, Anna remembered older women repeating those same words as if they were scripture. "Don't ever let an American near you," one had whispered during a raid, clutching her rosary with white knuckles. "Better to starve than let them look at you." It was easier to believe the fear than fight it. Fear didn't require proof. It only required hunger, darkness, and the steady thump of boots marching somewhere above. And then, Germany surrendered. 11 months had passed since that day, and still the fear lingered like smoke trapped in the walls. Berlin was carved into 4 sectors: American, British, French, Soviet. The Cold War had not yet been named, but it had already begun, one street at a time. Soviet guards screamed warnings at civilians. French patrols walked through shattered neighborhoods. American trucks growled through intersections where buildings leaned like tired old men. But the fear that gripped Berlin was older than politics and colder than snow. It was the fear of starvation. One Berlin doctor wrote in his diary, words that Anna would hear repeated in breadlines and cellars. "We do not treat sickness anymore. We treat different forms of starvation." Official rations in early 1946 averaged about 1,000 calories a day. On many days, it was less. A typical meal was a single potato, sometimes stretched with turnip or a broth that tasted only of boiled cabbage leaves. Bread was mixed with sawdust to make it heavier. Children were instructed to eat slowly so their stomachs could pretend to be full. Anna had become skilled at pretending. Every morning she would break a potato in half and slide the larger piece to her children. She would smile and tell them she had eaten earlier. They had grown used to believing her. In truth, she often went days without touching real food. The dizziness came first, then the shaking hands, then the brittle cold that crept into her bones. Climbing a flight of stairs left her breathless. Lifting Klaus onto her hip sometimes hurt her chest. But hunger sharpens the senses, and when she looked at her children, she felt a clarity that pushed everything else aside. She feared American soldiers, yes. She feared humiliation, rumors, the warnings etched into her memory. But she feared something else far more. If she did nothing, her children might not survive the spring. That fear had teeth. It gnawed at her through each night as she lay awake listening to her children's thin breathing. It pushed her out into the cold in shoes that leaked melting snow. It stood beside her now as she watched the American soldier shift his weight and exhale warm steam into the frozen air. He was so clean. That was the first thing she noticed. He smelled of soap. Not strong, not sweet, just clean. Clean in a way Berlin had forgotten. Clean like laundry that had actually dried, indoors, not like cloth left to freeze on a balcony. Clean like someone who had not slept in basements or stood in coal dust. There was tobacco on him, too. faint but familiar, and the dry scent of wool that had been brushed and warmed by a stove. It was the smell of order, of stability, of a world that still worked. Berlin did not smell like that. Berlin smelled of wet rags, of garbage that froze before it could rot, of damp basements filled with the breath of too many people. It smelled of extinguished fires and burned-out hopes. The contrast struck Anna so deeply she almost swayed. It was like looking through a cracked window into another universe. A voice seemed to rise inside her, not her own, but the memory of those wartime broadcasts. Amerikaner leben im Überfluss. Sie wollen uns demütigen. Americans live in abundance. They want to humiliate us. But another voice, quieter and more human, pushed back. He has food. The soldier had no idea what he represented as he stood there. His uniform was pressed. His pockets were full. He had a home waiting across the ocean, a life untouched by the rubble surrounding him. His country had suffered loss, yes, but it had not starved. While he ate beef and coffee at mess tables, entire neighborhoods here survived on thin soup. And he came from a nation that had not only won the war, but ended it with industrial momentum no one else could rival. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago. These cities had roared through the war with a fury that reshaped the world. American factories did not sleep. They simply changed what they built. First tanks, then refrigerators, then rations by the millions. Meanwhile, Berliners who once cheered for a 1,000-year Reich now stood in bread lines holding ration cards that bought almost nothing. Their empire had crumbled, and the ashes clung to them still. The soldier kicked another piece of rubble across the ice. He did not look threatening. If anything, he looked bored, maybe homesick. Just a boy from Brooklyn who had grown up listening to baseball games and factory whistles, suddenly thrown into the ruins of a place he had been taught to see as the enemy. Anna's heart pounded so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. She felt the weight of every story she had been told. Stories of assault, revenge, humiliation. Stories meant to keep women like her obedient, afraid, controlled. Stories built from propaganda, but welded to real fear. Her throat tightened. She squeezed Liesel's hand. Klaus's head lay heavy on her shoulder. She could feel how light he was, how fragile, how close the winter had come to taking him. Across the decades, an American viewer might look at this moment with a different kind of ache. They might remember fathers or grandfathers who once walked through Europe in uniforms just like this young soldier's. They might think of a time when America, though poorer than it is now, believed generosity was a duty, not an option. There was a time, older Americans often say, when a victory did not end with humiliation, but with rebuilding, when the strong felt obligated to lift up the weak, when Americans looked at the hungry, even if the hungry had once been their enemy, and felt something deeper than triumph. Anna did not know any of this. She only knew hunger. She only knew fear. But fear alone could not keep her children alive. And fear alone could not stop her eyes from drifting again and again to the soldier with the chocolate in his pocket. The enemy had food. That single truth, heavier than propaganda and louder than memory, was slowly pushing her toward a choice she had never imagined making. The choice to step out of hiding and approach the very men she had been raised to dread. The fear was still there, sharp, cold, suffocating. But beneath it, something else began to stir. A question, a possibility. A hope so faint it almost hurt. And fear, for all its power, could not silence that hope forever. For a long moment, Anna stood in the dark doorway, her breath shaking in the frozen air. The American soldier was only 20 steps away. 20 steps that separated hunger from danger, pride from survival, the life she had been taught to fear from the life her children needed. Snow collected on her shoulders. The cold bit through her shoes. In her arms, Klaus's head felt heavy. At her side, Liesel's hand felt hollow, almost weightless. Fear whispered its old warnings, but hunger spoke louder. Hunger had always spoken louder. She stepped out. The movement felt like stepping off a cliff. Her boot scraped the ground as she shifted Klaus higher on her hip, tightened her grip on Liesel, and walked straight into the open street. "Bitte," she tried, her voice barely a sound. The soldier didn't hear her. She forced her throat open. "Bitte." He turned. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The victor and the defeated. The fed and the starving. The 22-year-old who had crossed an ocean with a rifle, and the 28-year-old mother who had lost everything but the two children clinging to her. Snow drifted between them like slow-moving ash. Anna's heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear her pulse in her ears. Her knees wanted to fold, but she stood her ground, if only to keep her children upright beside her. Klaus hid his face in her coat. Liesel stared wide-eyed at the stranger. The soldier blinked, surprised. "Ma'am," he said softly, though she didn't understand. She lifted her chin with effort and forced out the few English words she had learned before the war tore her life apart. "Please, my children are hungry. Do you have anything?" The fear in her voice trembled like glass. She braced for a shout, for a gun raised, for humiliation. Instead, something in his expression broke open. Not pity, not shock, but recognition. The kind a human gives another human when all the propaganda in the world falls away. He shifted his rifle, behind him, letting it hang harmlessly at his back. Then he reached into the pocket of his field jacket. Anna held her breath. He pulled out a chocolate bar, then another, then a small round tin. Spam. For a second, the sight didn't register. Chocolate did not exist in Berlin anymore. Meat didn't either. These things belonged to another universe, not to the bombed-out world she knew. Still, the children didn't move. Fear held them in place like ice. The soldier seemed to understand. Slowly, almost theatrically, he peeled back the paper on one bar, broke off a square, and popped it into his own mouth. He chewed, then grinned at the children, sticking out his tongue just a little to show them the half-melted chocolate resting there like a secret. The gesture was small, silly, unexpected, and it shattered 5 years of Nazi radio in 1 second. Liesel inhaled sharply. Klaus peeked from his mother's coat. The smell reached them first. Rich, sweet, warm even in the cold air. A smell so powerful it cut through the rot of the ruins and awakened memories they didn't know they still had. Their bodies remembered even when their minds had forgotten. Real chocolate. Real sugar. Real food. Liesel stepped forward first, quick and bird-like. She snatched the bar and retreated just as fast. Klaus grabbed the other. Their fingers trembled. When they bit in, their eyes widened so suddenly Anna felt a twist of both joy and heartbreak. Watching them eat was like seeing color seep back into a black and white picture. The soldier wasn't finished. He nudged the tin of Spam toward Anna and she felt its weight in her hands, heavier than anything she had carried in weeks, heavier than ration cards, heavier than fear. He glanced up and down the street, then pointed toward the far end of the block. "Come," he said, tapping his lips, then gesturing again. Food. Anna froze. Trusting him meant stepping even deeper into uncertainty. But keeping her children here meant letting hunger finish what the war had started. A German woman would later write, "We stepped toward the people we had called devils, because hunger is stronger than fear." Anna nodded once. "Ja, we come." They walked together through the ruins, past burned-out streetcars, walls pocked with bullet holes, staircases that led nowhere. The American soldier kept a respectful distance, not touching them, but always close enough that Anna felt the strange safety of being near someone who looked well-fed and steady on his feet. After 10 minutes, the scent hit them. Warm air, frying fat, something sweet and yeasty. The mess tent rose from the snow like a small miracle. Ropes stiff with frost framed the canvas. Inside, stoves crackled and metal pans clattered. James O'Connor lifted the flap and motioned them in. Heat washed over them so suddenly Anna almost cried. Soldiers looked up from their trays, surprised but not hostile. James leaned toward a cook in a stained apron and spoke quickly in English. The man shrugged once, nodded, and turned to work. Minutes later, he placed 3 metal trays on the table. Thick slices of dark rye bread, bright squares of butter. 2 fried eggs for each person, mugs of warm pale milk made from American powder, and a bowl of canned peaches bathed in heavy golden syrup. Steam curled off everything like prayer. Anna stared. She had not seen so much food in one place since 1941. Her legs felt weak. She lowered herself onto the bench as if afraid the moment might vanish. James pulled out chairs for the children with the gentle politeness of someone raised by a mother who insisted on manners. Klaus ate first, grabbing bread with both hands, yolk dripping down his chin. Liesel tried to be proper but abandoned her fork after the second bite, using her fingers like a starving sparrow. No one laughed. Anna picked up a piece of bread. It was warm. The butter melted along the crust in yellow lines. She bit into it. Soft, rich, overwhelming. Tears rose before she could stop them. They slid hot down her cold cheeks, and for the first time in a long time, she did not wipe them away. A cook refilled their trays without being asked. Another brought more milk. A third quietly set a folded blanket beside Anna's elbow, pretending it was nothing. In another world, in another century, victors might have forced the defeated to kneel. Here, American privates were handing buttered bread to German children who had once been taught to hate them. Back home, the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago had just finished forging the arsenal that won the war. Now, those same foundries, farms, and supply lines were feeding strangers who only months earlier had been enemies. America's abundance hadn't slowed when the fighting stopped. It had simply changed shape, from tanks to tractors, from bombs to ration tins, from vengeance to breakfast. This was the greatest generation not because they were flawless, but because, standing over the ashes of a world, they still believed their morality had to stand higher than their victory. For Anna, for her children, for thousands like them, that belief tasted like warm bread, sweet peaches, and the first full meal in weeks. For James, it looked like 2 small children licking chocolate from their fingers, and a mother who cried silently into her hands because kindness, real kindness, was harder to bear than cruelty. And for every American watching today, it is a reminder. This is what the United States chose to do with its power. Not crush, not punish, but feed. Not all empires make that choice. But on that winter morning in 1946, one American private did, and everything that followed began with that single act of mercy in a cold Berlin mess tent. Anna had not meant to cry. She had not cried when bombs fell, when her apartment burned, when her husband never returned from the Eastern Front. She had not cried when ration cards grew thinner, or when Klaus fainted in the stairwell from hunger. But when she bit into that slice of bread, warm, soft, rich with melting butter, her body betrayed her. The tears came silently. then violently. They rolled down her cheeks in hot streaks, falling onto the crust she held with trembling fingers. Each tear carried something heavy: shame, relief, exhaustion, disbelief. This was food from the enemy, food from the men she had been taught to hate, food she had not stolen, not begged for, not traded for, simply been given. The guilt hit her first. I am eating what belongs to them, she thought. I am taking food from the hands that defeated us. Then a second, sharper thought followed. And if I don't, my children will die. The bread softened on her tongue. It tasted like life. And that, more than anything, broke her. For years she had clung to a thin strand of German pride, the belief that she could endure, that she could survive without lowering her dignity, that she would never reach out to those who occupied her city. But pride cannot feed a child. Pride cannot warm a starving body. Pride cannot replace a husband lost in a war fought for lies. And so, in that mess tent surrounded by men wearing the uniform she had feared for half a decade, her last defense collapsed. The walls built by voices on the radio, those deep, confident, hateful voices, crumbled beneath something as simple as bread and kindness. She saw James not as an enemy with a rifle, but as a young man with soft eyes, fumbling politeness and pockets full of food. She covered her face, shoulders shaking. James pretended not to notice, giving her the dignity of privacy. Perhaps he'd seen this before. Soldiers often had. Hunger could make ordinary people crumble in ways that gunfire never did. But he stayed close, as if to assure her that no harm would come. When they finished eating, he quietly pushed a spare blanket toward her and pointed at her children. Her throat tightened again. She had not been given a gift, an actual gift, in years. Everything in Berlin now came with a price. But here in this tent, surrounded by strangers, she felt something she barely recognized: safety. That night, after putting her children to bed on their thin mattresses, she knew what she had to do. She went to a small wooden box hidden beneath a broken floorboard. Inside lay the only object in her life that had survived the bombing intact: a porcelain angel her mother had given her on her wedding day. It was a fragile thing: white glaze, delicate wings, hands pressed in prayer. She had saved it through evacuation, air raids, cold nights, and hunger. She had shielded it from falling beams. She had wrapped it in cloth through 6 different apartments, each worse than the last. It was the last piece of her former life. She held it close, running her thumb over the smooth surface. Then she wrapped it in newspaper and tucked it under her coat. The next morning she walked to the corner where she and James had met. He was already there, stamping his feet in the cold, chewing Wrigley's gum like a boy waiting for a bus. When he saw her approach, he smiled. Not the smile of a conqueror, but the shy, unassuming smile of someone raised to be polite even in uniform. Before she could lose her courage, Anna pulled out the parcel and pressed it toward him with both hands. "For you," she whispered. "Bezahlung." Payment. James blinked in confusion, then gently pushed the bundle back toward her. "No," he said softly. "No pay." She tried again, more desperate this time. "Please, take. You give food, I give this." Still he shook his head. Then, without warning, he reached out and slipped the parcel back inside her coat, right against her heart. His fingers were gentle, careful not to startle her. "Just be okay," he murmured. "That's enough." It was the simplest sentence she had heard in years, and it undid her completely. This was something the propaganda never prepared her for. A kindness that asked nothing in return. A generosity that expected no loyalty, no payment, no thank you. It was a kindness that made pride feel small and hatred feel foolish. For the first time since the war ended, Anna felt something inside her realign. Not just gratitude, but the realization that she had been lied to. Not once, but for years. Not all Americans were monsters. Some were just young men far from home trying to do the right thing. For 3 weeks, James came every morning. He brought bread, powdered milk, tins of beans, peanut butter, chocolate bars, blankets. He always handed the food quietly, as if it were something private, almost secret. Some days he stayed to smile at the children. Other days he hurried off, late for his duties. Anna did not know how to thank him. She didn't have the language nor the words. She simply accepted the food and prayed that someday she could repay the debt. And then, one morning in late April, he was gone. She stood at the corner for an hour before accepting that he wasn't late. The next day she returned even earlier, scanning every uniform, every height, every walk. Nothing. A week passed. Then 2. Then a month. She came anyway, her coat wrapped tight, the porcelain angel still hidden in her home. He never returned. She did not know that America was pulling its soldiers home by the hundreds of thousands, that 1.6 million U.S. troops would pass through Germany in the post-war years, most rotating out so quickly that friendships ended mid-sentence. She did not know that James had been one of them, ordered back to Brooklyn with no time for farewells. She only knew the empty street where he had once stood. The second breakdown came quietly, without tears. It was the kind of heartbreak that settles into the ribs and stays there for years. Not romantic love, something deeper. Grief for a lifeline suddenly cut. Berlin's hunger only worsened. The winter of 1946-47 was one of the coldest in memory. Coal ran out, food ran out. People burned furniture to stay warm. Rations dropped below the level needed to sustain life. But Anna's children lived. Because of 3 weeks of American kindness, they survived just enough to face the next season. And somewhere across the ocean, in a country full of grocery stores and warm kitchens, James O'Connor never knew that the bread he shared had saved a family. For American viewers today, especially those whose fathers or grandfathers once marched through Europe, this act of anonymous goodness is familiar in its simplicity. Ordinary men doing quiet things that never made it into textbooks. For descendants of German families, it is something else. A debt of gratitude carried across generations. Because if not for men like him, the nameless privates, the ones who gave their rations, their blankets, their time, many families would never have made it through that winter. And Anna's story would have ended not in gratitude, but in grief. For months after James disappeared from the Berlin street corner, Anna lived inside a strange paradox. She owed her children's survival to an American soldier she would probably never see again. Yet his absence did not erase the mark he left on her life. If anything, it sharpened it. She had learned, through chocolate, bread, and a blanket, that kindness could come from places she had been taught to fear, and the lesson did not fade. Still, surviving was not the same as living. The winter of 1946-47 nearly broke Berlin for a second time. Coal shortages forced families to burn doors and cabinets. Food rations dropped so low that even the black market stalls seemed bare. Anna rationed every crumb, every potato slice, every pinch of powdered milk. She kept her children alive, but with a constant fear that one day she might not succeed. Then, early in 1948, the knock came on her door. It was the postman, holding a cardboard box stamped with bold English letters, CARKRE. He could barely lift it. £20, he muttered. From America. £20. Anna's breath caught. She carried the box inside as if it contained something sacred. Klaus and Liesel followed close behind, whispering as though afraid the moment might break. Inside the box lay wonders. A full pound of white sugar, sparkling like tiny diamonds. Instant coffee, sharp and rich even through its sealed tin. Powdered milk, more than enough for weeks. White flour soft as snow, unlike the coarse brown mix Berliners had grown used to. Canned meat, 2 tins of deviled ham, a luxury beyond imagination. Chocolate wrapped in paper identical to the bars James once carried. Anna pressed her hands over her mouth. No one in Berlin had seen so much food in one place since before the war. Klaus touched the flour with reverence. "Mama, is it real?" "Yes," she whispered. "It is real." She found a note tucked between the cans, handwritten, in English by a stranger overseas, to a family in need. "May this help you rebuild your life. We have more than we need. Please accept this with love." A stranger, in a country that had once bombed her city. A stranger who owed her nothing yet sent food across an ocean. This was not James. This was something larger. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States sent roughly $13 billion in aid to Western Europe through the Marshall Plan. West Germany alone received about $1.4 billion, the equivalent of more than $15 to $20 billion today, depending on how one measures inflation. It was a number so large that Berliners sometimes struggled to understand it. But Anna didn't need to understand economics. She understood the weight of a box in her hands, the physical translation of American abundance sent into German hunger. One afternoon, as she mixed white flour with powdered milk to make the first real bread her family had eaten in years, she whispered to herself, "The country that burned our city now sends milk for my children." When she told this to a neighbor, the woman responded with a line that would anchor itself in Anna's memory. "The stomach believes first, the heart believes later." Anna repeated those words for years. Her stomach believed. Her heart was beginning to catch up. With the city slowly stabilizing, opportunities began to appear. Churches reopened, schools rebuilt. And in a small basement room that still smelled faintly of smoke, an announcement was posted. "Training for nurses begins next month. Funded partly by American aid. Women of all ages welcome." Anna stood before the paper for several minutes. She had once cared for wounded neighbors during air raids, but never imagined herself as anything more than a mother struggling to keep her children fed. Yet the thought of learning to heal, really heal, not just survive, pulled at her. She enrolled. The classroom was cold, the windows frosted over. Students wore mismatched coats and gloves with frayed fingers. The chalk squeaked on the board as instructors taught anatomy, sanitation, and the latest techniques used in American military hospitals. Anna absorbed everything. She learned to wrap bandages correctly, to monitor pulses, to sanitize instruments. She studied late into the night by candlelight while her children slept. Years later, when she walked through the halls of a newly rebuilt hospital, floors polished, sheets white, hallways warm, she felt the distance between who she had been and who she had become. She was no longer the mother begging in the snow. She was a nurse, guiding patients through recovery. Not a victim, not a starving civilian, but part of the rebuilding. Her moral world had shifted, from fearing Americans to working alongside them, from distrust to gratitude, from surviving to helping others survive. Across the Atlantic, in Brooklyn, another awakening was taking place. By 1962, James O'Connor had lived an entire second. life. The young soldier who once handed out chocolate now wore a New York City fireman's uniform. His days were filled with smoke, sirens, collapsing staircases, and the heavy weight of hose water soaking his coat. He had 3 children. He had gray at his temples. He no longer expected to hear from Berlin again. Then, one evening, his wife laid an envelope on the kitchen table. Airmail, foreign stamps, careful handwriting. James opened it, and a photograph fell out. 3 teenagers stood in front of a new apartment block. Healthy, confident, smiling. Behind them, the building was fresh with paint, clean and modern. On the back of the photo was a short message written in precise English. "You once told my mother children didn't start the war. Because of you, we got to grow up." Signed, Anna, Klaus, Liesel, and Peter James sat down hard. His breath seemed to leave him. He opened the longer letter folded inside, a 4-page story written in the same careful hand. It told of that winter, of the bread, the peaches, the chocolate, of his sudden disappearance, of the care packages, of the Marshall Plan and the chance to study, of how Klaus had become an engineer, Liesel a teacher, and Peter a baby in Anna's womb when James shared his rations, a medical student training to save lives. James put the letter down and pressed a hand over his eyes. The scraps of food he had slipped from the mess tent were not scraps after all. They had become futures. They had become professions. They had become a family that existed, literally existed, because he had decided one snowy morning to share what America had in abundance. His awakening was quiet but profound. He finally understood. Kindness is never just kindness. It is an investment in lives we may never see again. For the American audience, this moment carries its own weight. The Marshall Plan wasn't simply politics. It was morality written into national policy, a decision by the United States to rebuild rather than punish, to nourish rather than dominate. There was a time, older Americans remember, when the country believed generosity was a form of power, when billions of dollars flowed toward nations that had once been enemies, not to control them, but to help them stand again. America used to build, people say now. We used to lift others up. We used to be proud of what we shared. James's letter from Berlin was proof of that legacy. A single soldier's kindness echoed outward, through classrooms, hospitals, construction sites, and eventually into the lives of children unborn when he walked the streets of Berlin. Do we still remember that we were once this generous? The voice of history asks softly. In 1962, James O'Connor remembered, and so did a family in Germany, whose tomorrow began the moment he reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. In the spring of 1963, the firehouse bell on East 14th Street clanged in its usual rough rhythm. Metal against metal, the pulse of a working-class New York neighborhood. But inside, the men of Ladder Company 12 were not preparing for another blaze. They were passing around a dented firefighter's helmet, dropping in folded bills and loose coins. James O'Connor, now 40, graying at the temples, shook his head each time someone contributed. "Come on," one of the men said, clapping him on the back. "You fed a whole family back then. Least we can do is feed you to Germany." Laughter echoed across the engine bay. The smell of diesel hung in the air, mixed with coffee and old hose water. By the end of the week, they had enough for a plane ticket. James had not left the country since the war. His hands trembled slightly as he packed. Shirts folded carefully beside a baseball glove he decided to bring at the last minute. Something about Germany, he sensed, needed that American touch. The flight on Pan American Airways was smoother than the troopship that had carried him overseas 18 years earlier. The cabin smelled of fuel, recycled air, and hot coffee poured from silver pots. Passengers murmured in different accents. Stewardesses moved gracefully through the aisle in crisp blue uniforms. James sat by the window, staring down at the clouds as the Atlantic rolled beneath them. He wondered what waited for him in the country he had once walked through with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Would Anna remember him clearly? Would the children recognize him? Would he recognize them? Frankfurt spread out below the descending plane. Modern runways, glass terminals, clean lines of concrete that bore no resemblance to the bombed fields he remembered. As he stepped off the aircraft, the warm June air carried a faint smell of fuel and grass. Then he saw them. A woman with silver hair pinned in a twist. Two tall young adults, one broad-shouldered, one slender and poised. A third, younger man with a student's coat and earnest eyes. They held flowers, and a cardboard sign written in careful, uneven English. "Welcome, James O'Connor." Anna reached him first. For a moment, she simply stood there, speechless, searching his face as if confirming that a memory had indeed become a person again. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. He held her with the gentleness of a man hugging someone he had once saved without realizing it. Klaus shook his hand so vigorously James almost laughed. Liesel hugged him shyly. Peter stood a little apart, eyes shining, as if looking at a man out of a family legend. A photographer clicked away. The next day, a German newspaper would run the photo with a headline simple and stunning: "Former enemies embrace at airport." For James, it felt like walking into a dream, one built not from battle reports but from years of gratitude that had crossed an ocean. West Germany in the 1960s was nothing like the ruins he remembered. Streets flowed smoothly beneath the car that carried them. Apartment buildings gleamed with fresh paint. Shops displayed new radios, clothing, and goods behind bright glass windows. Children rode bicycles past new factories built with American aid. It was the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Since 1947, West German industrial production had climbed more than threefold, fueled by a workforce hungry for stability and by the Marshall Plan funds that sparked recovery. Where rubble had once filled the streets, construction cranes now dotted the skyline. Anna guided James through the city, proud as though she had built it herself. "Klaus works repairing the Autobahn," she explained. "My son builds roads in a country that once had none left standing." "Liesel teaches English," she added with a smile. "She says language is how people stop being strangers." "And Peter?" James asked. He already had a suspicion. "In medical school," Anna said. "He wants to heal hearts." She paused. "I told him one American saved his before he was born." The words hit James harder than any firehouse impact. He didn't know what to say. He had gone to Germany once as a conqueror. He returned now as something far stranger, part of a family's foundation. That evening, Anna prepared a dinner that would have been unimaginable in 1946. Thick, pan-seared steaks glistening with juices, potatoes fried in butter until crisp at the edges, green beans tossed with pieces of bacon that filled the kitchen with a sweet, smoky aroma. "You made them big," she said, nodding toward her children. "Now I make you big." James laughed, embarrassed, but accepted the plate. It was the first time he had been cooked for by someone who had once feared him more than starvation. After dinner, they gathered in the courtyard behind the apartment block. The air smelled of warm stone and blooming lilacs. Neighbors leaned over their balconies, curious. James took the baseball glove from his suitcase, slapping the pocket with familiarity. He tossed the ball to Klaus, whose reflexes were fast but untrained. Laughter echoed through the courtyard. Liesel tried next, shrieking when the ball bounced off her wrist. Peter caught it on the third try, beaming. Each crack of the ball against the glove echoed differently from the explosions James remembered. It was the sound of something rebuilt, something alive. In a place where he had once heard artillery, he now heard laughter. That was the true legacy of kindness, a sound that replaced fear with joy. Decades passed. Letters crossed the ocean regularly. Photos of grandchildren arrived. Milestones were shared, graduations, promotions, new homes. Then, in 2003, another envelope arrived at the Brooklyn firehouse, addressed in Peter's handwriting. Inside was a formal wedding invitation. At the bottom, a handwritten note. "I am the baby my mother carried when you brought her peaches. You are my American grandfather. Please come. The ticket is paid." James was 80, but still strong enough to travel. When he entered the wedding hall in Munich, a place glowing with candlelight, white linens, and the smell of roast meat, the room fell quiet. Peter, now a heart surgeon, crossed the floor and embraced him. "This man," he said to the guests, "fed my mother and saved my siblings. Without him, I would not be alive to marry today." When the band began to play, the bride walked not to her new husband for the first dance, but to James. "You saved him," she said softly, "before he was born." He held her hand, trembling, and stepped into the dance. Applause filled the hall. Cameras flashed, glasses clinked. A man who once walked through Germany with a rifle now danced at a German wedding with flowers pinned to his lapel. The greatest generation had not only won a war, they had stitched together something larger, bridges of humanity that lasted 60 years, stretching from a snowy Berlin street to a wedding hall filled with laughter. Some legacies are carved into monuments, others are carved into families. James O'Connor's legacy lived in both worlds, and the world was better for it. Brooklyn, 2011. The church was small, the kind built before the war with dark wooden pews and stained glass that glowed faintly in the morning light. The air smelled of wax and old hymn books. At the front of the sanctuary rested a wooden casket draped with an American flag. Beside it sat a New York Fire Department helmet, blackened from years of smoke, worn from a lifetime of answering alarms. James O'Connor had come home for the last time. He was 88. His hands had long since steadied 1,000 frightened strangers. His voice had called out through stairwells filled with smoke. And decades before that, on a ruined street in Berlin, his pocket had held a bar of chocolate that would change a family's fate. When the side doors opened, a hush fell over the room. 4 figures walked slowly down the aisle. Klaus, tall and gray at the temples. Liesel, still carrying the posture of a teacher. Peter, the surgeon with steady hands. And between them, frail but dignified, walked Anna. She leaned on her cane, her eyes glistening with tears she had not allowed herself to shed in 1946. In her hands she carried a small cloth bundle. When they reached the casket, she unwrapped it with trembling fingers. The porcelain angel, still smooth, still unchipped after more than 60 years, caught the light for a brief moment before she placed it gently atop the folded flag. The click of porcelain against wood was so soft it was almost a prayer. The priest opened a folded paper and read the words Anna had written with Peter's help. "When the world had almost no bread left, he shared his bread with my children. Because of him we lived to rebuild, to learn, to heal. We came across an ocean to say thank you." people in the pews wiped their eyes. Firefighters in dress blues bowed their heads. James's grandchildren stared at the German family standing before them, suddenly understanding that their grandfather had held more than a hose and an axe. He had once held the survival of strangers in the palm of his hand. And in that quiet moment, the church seemed to hold not just a funeral, but a history. To understand the weight of this story, you must pull back and see the scale of the world that shaped it. World War II killed more than 60 million people, soldiers and civilians from every corner of the globe. More than 400,000 American service members never came home. Germany lost millions more. Cities burned. Borders collapsed. Families vanished. Yet, after the fighting stopped, something extraordinary happened. The United States did not demand revenge, nor did it starve its former enemies into submission. Instead, through the Marshall Plan, it sent the equivalent of more than $150 billion in today's money to rebuild Europe. West Germany alone received around $1.4 billion, which helped transform rubble into factories, hunger into industry, despair into a future. American families mailed nearly 10 million care packages, boxes of flour, sugar, coffee, canned meat, purchased by ordinary citizens who simply wanted to help people they would never meet. And across POW camps during the war, American soldiers followed the Geneva Convention even when the enemy did not. They fed prisoners, housed them humanely, let them work for wages, and, most importantly, treated them as men, not monsters. A single private with a chocolate bar cannot change those statistics, but he can change a family. 3 generations, and the way 2 nations remember each other. For Americans watching today, the story carries 4 quiet messages. Pride, first of all. When someone says America only ever cared about power, remember this. Your grandparents helped feed the very people who once fought against them. They rebuilt not just their own country but others too. They used abundance as a weapon against despair. They believed morality mattered, not as a slogan but as policy and practice. Second, nostalgia and connection. There was a time when America was united not by perfection but by purpose. Factory workers, farmhands, soldiers, nurses, all believed that the nation's strength was measured not only in battles won but in lives lifted. Many viewers today have fathers or grandfathers who served in Europe, and when they hear James's story, they wonder quietly, maybe my grandpa did something like that too. Third, comparison, gentle but unavoidable. Today, we argue over elections, headlines, cable news, and posts on screens. But once this nation agreed on at least one truth. Children of the enemy were still children, still deserving of food, safety, dignity, still human. It is worth asking, do we still believe that? Finally, gratitude, spoken across oceans and generations. If you are watching this video from a warm home in Germany, America, Canada, Australia, perhaps your grandparents survived because an American soldier shared his rations, his kindness, his rules of war. Thousands of families carry the echo of those choices in their lives today, and so we return to the church in Brooklyn. The angel rests atop the flag. The fireman's helmet gleams softly. The priest's voice settles into silence. In the end, the lesson is simple. America's greatest weapon wasn't its bombs. It was its abundance, and the quiet courage of ordinary people willing to share it. The story you've heard did not take place in a POW camp in Texas or Wisconsin or Oklahoma, but it belongs to the same tradition. The same moral backbone, the same greatest generation who believed that victory meant responsibility. Whether caring for German POWs on American soil or feeding starving children in Berlin, the message was the same. When Americans chose kindness, former enemies called them family. And in a small church in 2011, that family came to say goodbye.